Are you mentally ill? Have you ever experienced the big sad? Do you come home from work feeling unfulfilled, chronically stressed, and empty inside? Well, you're not alone. In 2019, 970 million people globally were living with a mental disorder, with anxiety and depression being the most common. When your disorders aren't even unique. In the United States, in our Lord's year of 2021, there were an estimated 57.8 million adults with at least one mental illness, representing 22.8% of all Americans, or 1 in 5 Americans. American women are more likely to report having a mental illness than American men, with 27% of women having a mental illness compared to 18.1% of men. We'll return to that later. Mental illness is up. Rent is up. Inflation is up. Wages are down. Could these things be connected? And the mental health industry has grown alongside the increasingly ill population. Big Pharma is reaching record profits selling drugs as quick fixes to a mentally ill population. Historian and Harvard professor Anne Harrington and writer of Mind Fixers, Psychiatry's Troubled Search for the Biology of Mental Illness, talks about pharmaceutical companies' role in shifting treatment away from a psychosocial model to a biomedical model. She states, "We don't know enough about the biology of these mental disorders to know whether or not some of the reasons are biological, in the sense that medicine likes to think of these things as diseases, and whether it's just because they're having terrible problems. I would love to see a larger, more pluralistic set of options." Since the first Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, was published in 1952, the categories and numbers of mental illnesses have only increased. The DSM is the Bible for psychologists. It essentially categorizes every mental illness and how to diagnose them. The first edition of the DSM included 106 diagnoses, whereas the most recent edition, the DSM-5, has 298 diagnoses. So the classifications for mental illness, according to the DSM, have almost tripled since the 1950s. So what's the deal? Are we getting more fucked up, or do we now have more granular language to describe problems we've always had? Sociologist Bruce M.Z. Cohen addresses this question in his book, Psychiatric Hegemony, a Marxist Theory of Mental Illness. According to Cohen, there is no evidence that any mental illness is a real observable disease. So you're saying I'm just like this? So how does Cohen make his argument? Well, he states that there is a common misconception that mental illness is caused by chemical imbalances in the brain. But recent studies have casted doubt on the biomedical model of psychiatry, suggesting that that may not be the case. Yet, there has been doubt surrounding the causal relationship between chemical imbalances in the brain and mental disorders for decades. In 2010, American psychiatrist Daniel Carlott declared, "I say that chemical imbalances in the brain, not because I really believe it, because I know that the evidence isn't really there for us to understand the mechanism. I think I say that because patients want to know something, and they want to know that we as physicians have some basic understanding of what we're doing when we're prescribing medications. And they certainly don't want to hear that a psychiatrist essentially has no idea how these medications work." Yikes. The real problem that Cohen is stating here is that there appears to be an alarming lack of proof of biological causation for mental disorders. What that means is that there haven't necessarily been biological signs for mental disorders. The idea is that you need to tell somebody your symptoms for them to diagnose you. You can't be diagnosed for anxiety or depression with a blood test. Cohen writes, "The field of mental health still does not have a biological marker or genetic test that can be used for diagnostic purposes." However, despite the lack of biological determinants to conclusively diagnose mental illness, there are psychiatrists that evidently have the power to diagnose and provide prescriptions. But how reliable are these psychiatrists' diagnoses? That's the question that psychologist David Rosenhan's 1973 study on being sane in insane places tried to answer. On being sane in insane places had two parts. During the first part, 3 women and 6 men, all mentally healthy, would attempt to be institutionalized in 12 different psychiatric facilities in 5 different states by faking mental illness. Each of them pretended to have auditory hallucinations, and every single fake patient was admitted and diagnosed with a mental illness. As soon as they were admitted, the fake patients were told to act completely normal and tell staff that they no longer had any hallucinations. But as a condition for their release, each patient had to agree to take antipsychotic medication. All but one was diagnosed with schizophrenia. During the second part of the study, a hospital challenged Rosenhan to send fake patients to their facility, insisting that their staff would be able to identify the fakes. Rosenhan agreed, and over the course of the next few weeks, 41 out of 193 new patients were identified as fakers. Rosenhan then revealed that he had sent no fakers to the hospital. Psychologists hate him. I mean, this is a pretty big problem. Psychologists have the power under certain circumstances to detain people involuntarily. They have the power to prescribe people brain-altering medication, and they can't tell who's mentally healthy from who's mentally ill. Imagine if you went to your doctor claiming that you had cancer and then they just took your word for it and started chemo. But maybe all hope for the psychological profession is not lost. There's many Rosenhan detractors. Some people say that he provided fabricated data, inconsistent descriptions, and even question whether or not several of the patients participated in the study at all. And I know what you're thinking, it was the 70s. Surely this wouldn't happen today with our more sophisticated technologies and understandings of mental health. That's an interesting hypothesis you have there. It would be a shame if something disproved it. In 2008, the BBC aired a 2-part program called How Mad Are You?, inspired by Rosenhan's experiment. In it, 10 volunteers, 5 with previously diagnosed mental health disorders and 5 without, are observed for a week by a team of experts. The experts include a psychiatrist, a professor of clinical psychology, and a psychiatric nurse. The volunteers perform a series of tests designed to determine symptoms of mental illness. Ultimately, the panel of experts was able to correctly identify 2 of the mentally ill patients as mentally ill, but they also misdiagnosed 2 of the healthy patients as mentally ill. They also misdiagnosed 1 patient who was mentally ill, but not with the disorder that the experts concluded. One of the criticisms of this study was that there wasn't enough time for the panel to properly evaluate the patients. I thought that this was slightly amusing because if I can provide a small anecdote, I went to see a psychiatrist a few years ago and spoke to her for maybe 30 minutes about my mental health history. Within half an hour, she diagnosed me with generalized anxiety disorder and gave me a prescription for Lexapro. Now, am I saying that the field of psychiatry is rampant with corruption? Maybe. Could be.
Oui. Peut-être.
Well, when there's been a historically documented close relationship between pharmaceutical companies and mental health practitioners, and in 2016, over half of active psychiatrists, 55.7%, received some form of payment from pharmaceutical manufacturers, is it a sin for a girl to wonder? At the very least, it seems like a conflict of interest. Now, in the research for this video, I discovered that there's actually a whole anti-psychiatry movement. I personally am not necessarily anti-psychiatry. I have a therapist. But I do think that we should think critically about our systems. I think that we should be especially critical when it comes to the relationship between money and health, whether that be mental health or otherwise. The people who are supposed to help us at our most vulnerable should not be people that have financial ties to any particular industry which is set on maximizing profits. That could be viewed as a critique of the healthcare system at large, which it is. Universal healthcare now. One of Cohen's primary critiques of the institution of psychiatry is that the diagnoses of mental illness are not reliable and valid. What does he mean by this? Well, reliability means that the outcome is consistent when an experiment is performed more than once. Validity means that whatever you're using to measure actually measures what it's supposed to measure. In the context of psychology, that would mean that if a test determining mental illness was reliable, it would always provide you with the correct diagnosis. If the test was valid, it means that it's actually testing whether or not somebody has mental illness. For example, if you took a math test and concluded based on the score that you had a mental disorder, that would be invalid because the parameters aren't accurate. Cohen writes, "In infectious medicine, a diagnostic manual needs to be both reliable and valid in order to be truly useful. A classification system that is reliable enables physicians to distinguish between different diseases and to then prescribe a treatment specific to a disease, which has been validated through studies of its clinical course and, if possible, an understanding of its pathology as real." A study conducted by the psychologists at the University of Notre Dame, published in 2016, called Method Matters, Understanding Diagnostic Reliability in the DSM-5, stated that the current results, together with those of the DSM-5 field trials, raise questions about the reliability and validity of DSM diagnoses. Our results add to the large body of literature documenting the limitations of categorical diagnoses and indicate that there is significant room for improvement in diagnostic reliability. At the very least, our results indicate that psychopathology researchers should give the issue of diagnostic reliability more than cursory attention. Cohen argues that there is no evidence for the supposed science of psychiatry. He says that there's no test for any mental illness, no proof of causation, no evidence of successful treatment that relates specifically to an individual disorder, and no accurate prediction of future cases. Thus, he claims, the claim that psychiatric constructs are real diseases has not been proven. Within psychological scholarship, there's what's called a biomedical model and a psychosocial model. The biomedical model conceptualizes disease as a physical pathology of the body. Thus, biomedical psychiatry theorizes mental disorder as having a physical etiology, causation, that can be observed, measured, and treated. Modern psychiatry focuses on the brain as the organ that causes such a disease, and most often regards mental illness as the result of faulty neurotransmitters or chemical imbalances in the brain. The psychosocial model, however, highlights a range of evidence from socioeconomic data which demonstrates that such factors as family income, educational level, ethnic group, geographical location, and social class are all closely related to the chances of developing a mental health problem. While the social model suggests that we all have the potential to suffer mental disorder if exposed to traumatic situations, some groups are particularly vulnerable to mental illness due to experiencing comparatively more stressful life conditions and, at the same time, having less access to cultural and economic resources, which can alleviate the threat of mental health problems. The World Health Organization affirms this thinking, stating in their 2013 Mental Health Action Plan that, depending on the local context, certain individuals and groups in society may be placed at significantly higher risk of experiencing mental health problems. These vulnerable groups may include members of households living in poverty, people with chronic health conditions, infants and children exposed to maltreatment and neglect, adolescents first exposed to substance use, minority groups, indigenous populations, older people, people experiencing discrimination and human rights violations, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people, prisoners, people exposed to conflict, natural disasters, or other humanitarian emergencies. Another interesting social element that may lead to higher rates of mental illness is the level of income inequality in a country. The study Income Inequality and the Prevalence of Mental Illness, a preliminary international analysis conducted by epidemiologists Kate Pickett, Richard Gerald Wilkson, and Oliver James, used data from the World Health Organization to determine the link between income inequality and rates of mental illness. It states, This preliminary analysis suggests that higher national levels of income inequality are linked to a higher prevalence of mental illness, and in contrast with studies of physical morbidity and mortality, as countries get richer, rates of mental illness increase. Who gets to decide what is normal? How many times do you have to cry to be considered depressed? We've all taken those surveys. How many times a week do you recall feeling hopeless? None at all? A few times? Many times? All the time? But what's the right amount of hopelessness for a human being? And at what point do regular human emotions become pathologized? What does it really mean to be normal? Well, it really depends. It depends on the time and place that you're living in. Until the 1970s, homosexuality was classified as a mental illness in the DSM. Homosexuality was considered a sexual deviation within the larger category of personality disorders alongside pedophilia, fetishism, and sexual sadism. The APA says no kink at Pride. It's examples like these that lead Cohen to argue that psychology is a tool used to police social deviance. In every society, there are a set of norms that people are expected to abide by. If you don't, you're thrown to the edge of the world and shunned. But these norms change over time. The majority of people in the United States today don't believe that being gay is a mental illness, but all this change is public opinion. If the diagnoses are accurate, they should be accurate across time and space. But if the diagnoses change alongside public opinion, it does raise questions into how reliable the psychiatric practice is as identifying disorders. What causes historical change? According to Karl Marx, the source of human progress and historical change is not to be found in legal relations or political forms, but rather in the material conditions of life. By this, Marx means that the economic relations of human beings determine all other relations in that society. Marx writes, in the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations, which are independent of their will, namely relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. The mode of production consists of the forces of production, meaning the technologies and raw materials used to produce, and the relations of production, which refers to the relationship between those who own the means of production, in our day, factories, offices, businesses, and so on, so the capitalists or the bourgeoisie, and those who do not, the workers or the proletariat. Cohen writes, unique to capitalist society, the means of production are privately owned, with the goal of the ruling classes to accumulate and maximize profit through a competitive and expanding market for commodities. Capitalist society is therefore marked by a fundamental disparity in the distribution of economic resources between the majority of the population, the working classes, who are only free to sell their labor to the bourgeoisie, and the small elite, who own and control the economic base. It is a system of exploitation in which the workers generate surplus value for the ruling classes from their labor, are alienated from what they produce, and in turn are commodified by this process. The workers are kept at subsistence wages, while the elite accumulate greater wealth. The rich will get richer, prophesied Marx, while the poor will get poorer. Capitalists be like, step 1, monopolize the means of production. Step 2, profit. In any society, the dominant values and norms will be decided by the ruling classes. We've established that we live in a capitalist society, hence the dominant norms are decided by the capitalists. But what does this have to do with the field of psychology? Well, no industry is exempt from capitalist influence. In what ways could psychologists serve the capitalist project? Well, say that you're depressed. I mean, you're watching this video, so. Say that you're depressed, you spend all day working for subsistence wages, and when you get home, you're so tired that you get into bed and scroll on TikTok until you fall asleep. Eventually, you might start to feel like, wait, this isn't right. Couldn't we build a society where I don't have to toil away 40 hours a week to enrich shareholders? I don't feel good about this. So you go to the psychologist. And wouldn't it be convenient if they tried to convince you that being unsuited for capitalist society made you the problem? Are we being gaslit by the capitalists? A nurse working on the construction site of the Channel Tunnel, which connects England and France, spoke of the working conditions within the tunnel. She said that the project was huge, that deadlines were tight, and that workers were suffering terrible conditions inside of the tunnel. When asked how complicated her job was as on-site personnel for such a massive project, she responded, "The men mostly come to me complaining of terrible headaches. My job is to give them 2 aspirin and get them back down the tunnel as quickly as possible." How does medicine function under a capitalist society? Cohen argues that the priorities of the institution favor those of capitalism and the ruling class. He says, for example, that the modern system of healthcare emerged out of the need for a healthier and more reliable industrial workforce. Philippe Pinel was a French psychiatrist, sometimes referred to as the father of modern psychiatry. Pinel believed in a more humane approach to treating the insane. In particular, he advocated for the unchaining of the mad and the end of practices like putting the insane into shackles. Cohen writes, Pinel's traitement moral was hailed as a truly humanitarian approach to the management of the mad, which reflected the rationalism of the new industrial world. Rather than forwarding an organic etiology for madness, patient case studies suggest to Pinel that particular life events or trauma was at the root of their disturbed behavior. It was felt that moral means could correct the actions of the insane through a more understanding response involving listening to patient complaints, reasoning with them, and showing kindness. But it wasn't all roses and sunshine. Pinel believed that successful treatment depended on the employment of psychological fear and terror to gain the compliance of the insane. He believed in the art of subjugating and taming the insane and the effectiveness of a type of apparatus of fear, of firm and consistent opposition to their dominating and stubbornly held ideas. Only proportional punishment, though, straitjackets and solitary confinement included. He believed that insanity could be treated and cured. In his treatise on insanity, he wrote, "Few subjects in medicine are so intimately connected with the history and the philosophy of the human mind as insanity. There are still fewer where there are so many errors to rectify and so many prejudices to remove. Derangement of the understanding is generally considered as an effect of an organic lesion of the brain, consequently as incurable, a supposition that is, in a great number of instances, contrary to anatomical fact." Here he's saying, like Cohen, that there isn't a so-called chemical imbalance in the brain or observable problem that causes mental illness. Rather, he thought that traumatic events were the root of his patient's strange behavior. This debate within psychiatry calls back to the age-old question of nature versus nurture. Are human beings a result of their genetic composition, or are they a result of their social environment? Sound off in the comments below! All in all, Pinel revolutionized ideas about insanity and influenced how the so-called mad were treated across the United States and Europe. Historian Georges Rousseau stated in 1991 that it is perhaps not going too far to maintain that Pinel has been to 18th century psychiatry what Newton was to its natural philosophy and Linnaeus to its taxonomy. The insane in 19th century Europe were relegated to asylums, harsh punishments such as bloodletting, beatings, and purgings, and hardly seen as human. The social reformer Harriet Martineau wrote of the Hanwell Lunatic Asylum in London. In pauper asylums, we see chains and strait waistcoats, 3 or 4 half-naked creatures thrust into a chamber filled with straw to exasperate each other with their clamor and attempts at violence, or else gibbering in idleness or moping in solitude. Michel Foucault discusses Pinel's approach in his work Madness and Civilization. Foucault writes, "From the outset, psychiatry has had as its project to be a function of social order. As an example, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia has lists of reasons for admission of patients which included asthma, laziness, egotism, domestic troubles, greediness, bad whiskey, desertion by husband, there's nothing like a mad woman, immoral life, laziness, novel reading, politics, and uterine derangement." Another behavior pathologized by 19th century psychologists was frequent masturbation, otherwise known as masturbatory insanity. Cohen writes, "As the label suggests, the profession theorized that masturbation was not only an unhygienic and deviant behavior, but one which led to insanity and even suicide." Still being offered for the sufferer as late as the 1930s, treatment options included restraining devices and mechanical appliances, circumcision, cautery of the genitals, clitoridectomy, and castration. Widely recognized as the founder of British psychiatry, Henry Maudsley was particularly vocal in his disdain for those engaging in such behavior. "The sooner the masturbator sinks to his degraded rest, the better for the world which is well rid of him." Please, said Maudsley. The classification was a clear case of the mad doctors medicalizing deviant behavior. Women were a specific target for the masturbatory insanity label, especially if they were unable to fulfill their roles as wives, mothers, and homemakers. In the second half of the 19th century, psychiatrists began to focus on female mental illnesses like hysteria and nymphomania. Isaac Baker Brown, an English gynecologist, promoted clitoridectomies, the surgical removal of the clitoris, as a treatment for masturbatory insanity. Brown was a firm proponent of the idea that female madness was partially caused by masturbation, with symptoms including neglecting housework and female responsibilities. Cohen writes, "From 1859, he performed clitoridectomies on women and girls as young as 10 years old for a variety of deviations, including a 20-year-old who disobeyed her mother and was a serious reader, a woman who was forward and open with men and never had an offer of marriage, an unmarried dressmaker with digestive problems, and more." Brown's surgical mutilations were particularly recommended for uncooperative wives, with Showalter noting that he urged clitoridectomy for women seeking divorce and believed that the operation would make them more contented and certainly more manageable wives. His career ended when the public found out that he was performing clitoridectomies without the consent of the patients. As with prisons, insane asylums expanded substantially over the 19th century, both in the United States and in the United Kingdom. For example, in the UK in 1850, there were 7,140 people in public asylums, whereas in 1954 there were 148,000. Andrew Scull, a British-born sociologist who researches the social history of medicine and the history of psychiatry, noted that as the number of people admitted into these institutions increased, the rate of curability, rated by the number of people discharged from the asylums, actually decreased. So what kind of treatments were being used? Ladies, do you want to get a lobotomy? Did you know that the guy who invented a lobotomy got a Nobel Prize? Well, so did Henry Kissinger. You know, they're just handing them out to anyone nowadays. His name was Egas Manes, and he was a Portuguese neurologist. Cohen writes, Like the majority of subsequent lobotomies, Manes' first procedure was carried out on a woman, in this case a former prostitute. The operation is described as Manes drilling holes into her skull, using a syringe to squirt absolute alcohol onto the exposed white fibers, which killed tissue through dehydration, and then sewing her back up. The woman was subsequently returned to the asylum, where the psychiatrist reported that she remained in a calm state. Following this successful operation, further prefrontal operations on the incarcerated population were performed, and by 1936, Manes was advertising his drilling procedure as demonstrated marked improvements in all of the operated patients, including the observation that post-operative manic depressives had become less emotional. Despite being extremely dangerous and resulting in seizures or occasionally death, in the 1950s, over 20,000 people were lobotomized. A comprehensive survey of U.S. psychiatric facilities between 1949 and 1951 found that most patients lobotomized by doctors were women. There's nothing like a mad woman. What a shame she went mad. Women like Rosemary Kennedy, for example. And yes, those Kennedys. Rosemary Kennedy was the sister of John F. Kennedy. It was thought that she may have had an intellectual disability. The Kennedys put in a great amount of effort into hiding her away for fear that she would mess up their political careers. At the age of 23, her family said that she had become increasingly irritable and difficult. She had seizures, mood swings, hit others, and was sneaking out of the convent that her parents put her in at night. The nuns were afraid that she had sexual partners and that she would get pregnant or contract an STD. In response to her erratic behavior, Rosemary's father, Joseph Kennedy, decided to get her a lobotomy. He did not tell Rosemary's mother of this plan and called the most popular proponents of lobotomy in the United States at the time, James W. Watts and Walter Freeman. They were called Rosemary's procedure. After Rosemary was mildly sedated, we went through the top of the head, Dr. Watts recalled. I think she was awake. She had a mild tranquilizer. I made a surgical incision in the brain through the skull. It was near the front. It was on both sides. We just made a small incision, no more than an inch. The instrument Dr. Watts used looked like a butter knife. He swung it up and down to cut the brain tissue. We put an instrument inside, he said. As Dr. Watts cut, Dr. Freeman asked Rosemary, for example, to recite the Lord's Prayer or sing God Bless America or count backwards. We tried to estimate thus how far to further cut based upon how Rosemary responded. When she became incoherent, they ceased cutting. The procedure left her unable to walk, unable to speak intelligibly, and incontinent. She was institutionalized immediately after. Their scientific method is to just keep cutting somebody's brain until they can't speak anymore. Did you know that the word hysteria derives from the Greek word hysteros, which means uterus? The idea that women are more likely to be insane has been frequent across time and history. To prove it to you, I Googled women and irrationality. Are women irrational by nature? Yes. Women are more emotional beings than logical beings. Cohen writes, women have outnumbered men as psychiatric patients since the mid-19th century, and they have been more likely to receive psychiatric treatment, ranging from hospitalization in asylum, accompanied by restraint, electroconvulsive therapy, and psychosurgery, to psychological therapy and psychotropic drug treatments today. Many women were incarcerated in asylums for making claims of sexual abuse against their family, for mothering illegitimate children, or for suspected lesbianism. Be gay, do crime, etc. After the Age of Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries, thinkers across Europe moved towards reason as the ultimate barometer for morality. It couldn't simply be said that women were inferior to men because it says so in the Bible. It would have to be proven with scientific principles. The argument would have to be founded in the biological differences between men and women, namely women's capacity to reproduce. Menstruation, pregnancy, and puberty were thought to make women weaker than men, both physically and mentally. Therefore, they were more vulnerable to bouts of insanity. This was used as a justification for the new emerging division of labor as Europe shifted from agrarian to industrial society. Across Europe in the 19th century, the woman question was hotly debated. As previously mentioned, women could be sent to the insane asylum for a number of reasons. Sleeping around, not wanting to be a housewife, being a lesbian, being politically active. Basically, if you rejected virtues of traditional femininity, chastity, homemaking, etc., you could be sent to the slammer. Or worse, lobotomized. The lobotomy has fallen out of vogue. What's in now? Drugs. Because the drugs never work. Making Sense of the Chemical Revolution by historian Benoit Majerus states, the introduction of the first antipsychotic, chlorpromazine in the first half of the 1950s and the first antidepressant in the late 1950s is said to have profoundly changed practices and to have permanently integrated psychiatry into the field of modern medicine. Nowadays, we have Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, take your pick. The drugs to treat mental illness have become a business and in themselves part of big pharma. But do these drugs actually work? Medical News Today reported on a study done by scientists at the Nordic Cochrane Center in Denmark on the efficacy of antidepressants. The study concluded that there is little evidence to show that antidepressants perform better than placebos. Joanna Moncrieff, British psychiatrist and professor at University College London, states in her book, The Myth of the Chemical Cure, psychiatric drug treatment is currently administered on the basis of a huge collective myth. The myth that psychiatric drugs act by correcting the biological basis of psychiatric symptoms or diseases. Now, the conversation surrounding drugs and mental health can be a bit tense. Speaking from personal experience, I know that many people would not be able to function as they want to without meds. This isn't negating that experience. Rather, it's calling into question the efficacy of these drugs and the systems of power that benefit from their expansion and prescription. I'd love to hear from you mentally ill people in the comments on if you've tried antidepressants, anxiety meds, whatever, and if they helped you and you genuinely found them beneficial. Sound off in the comments below. But before that, let's talk more about systems of power. Systems of power. Systems of power. Do you know this man? He's a legend. He's a commie. He's Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci is an Italian intellectual who is most popularly known for his theory of cultural hegemony. Cultural hegemony is all about how the ruling class uses, you guessed it, culture to control the masses. So what kind of cultural tools are we talking here? Well, we got religion, education, media, the family. An idea has reached hegemonic status when it is so ubiquitous that it's almost impossible to question it. The way that a serf may look at you if you were a free thinker during medieval Europe, saying, well, really, why do we need the divine right of kings anyway? Well, they would say, it's the natural order of things. And of course, now that we live in a capitalist society rather than a feudal one, people make the same statements. It's the natural order of things. Something, something, human nature, something, something, philosophy. Anyway, the ruling class has a vested interest in convincing the public that their circumstances are totally natural. The feudal lords of yesterday have been replaced with the landlords of today. Sociologist Nick Crossley writes, the bourgeoisie must win the hearts and minds of the people, persuading them, without even seeming to do so or to need to do so, that the status quo is natural and inevitable, beneficial for all, and inducing them to identify with it. So how does this relate to the field of medicine, and by extension, the mental health field? Vicente Navarro, Spanish sociologist and political scientist, writes in his work Radicalism, Marxism, and Medicine, Medical knowledge is not produced and reproduced in the abstract, but through agents and relations which are bearers of power relations of which class is a determinate one. To say this is not to say that medical and scientific knowledge does not have an autonomy of its own, but that autonomy takes place within a set of power relations which determines not only how medical knowledge is used, but also what knowledge is produced and how that knowledge is produced. So the idea is that the field of medicine is not free from bias, and varying power structures exist within the field. We can see the impact of institutionalized racism in ideas prevalent in doctors such as believing that black patients are less sensitive to pain. Fanon talks about this kind of medical racism in his work Towards the African Revolution. I actually have Fanon, but this is not towards this is Wretched of the Earth right here. In the chapter, The North African Syndrome, Fanon discusses how white French doctors would dismiss the pain of North Africans, chalking their complaints up to laziness. The sciences have great potential for propaganda because people view them to be objective and value-free, despite historically that not necessarily being the case. So, to recap, we live in a capitalist society. There are different ways that the ruling class can exert power over the public. The ways that seem obvious, like the army and the police, and the ways that are more subtle, like the media, religion, and cultural norms. The field of medicine is not devoid of cultural ideas and power structures. Cohen is arguing that the ruling class can use the field of medicine to exert control over the population. But to what end? Neoliberalism, oh neoliberalism, neoliberalism, oh neoliberalism. Cohen defines neoliberalism as an economic theory which seeks to free capital from government regulation and restraint in the belief that this is the most successful and efficient means of achieving wealth and happiness for the greatest number. Characteristics of neoliberalism include strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. Sounds great, right? Wrong. Neoliberals like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher cut public spending drastically. Healthcare? We don't need it. Housing? Get out of here. Education? Bah! You're poor? Well, that's too damn bad! But neoliberal policies didn't only apply economically. They also came alongside cultural shifts. Remember the base and the superstructure? Economic systems inform culture. Marx said that the economic relations of human beings determine all other relations in that society. So how would a system focused on private capital accumulation change the way that we relate to one another? Moncrieff writes that in tandem with the rise of neoliberalism, there was an evolving cultural and moral ethos, which is best summed up by a change from broad acceptance of collective virtues such as equality and solidarity to the individual and intertwined values of competition and consumerism. So we have a shift in values from the communal to the individual. So what does it mean if you're not thriving under this system? If you've been traditionally excluded from the means of capital accumulation because you're black, because you're a woman, because you're disabled, the capitalist says, it's all your fault. Fuck you, you lazy piece of shit. Broke people should never laugh. The systems of oppression interacting to keep working class people of all backgrounds subjugated. System mistem. You're a woman who's struggling to keep up being responsible for the majority of housework and child rearing while simultaneously working 40 hours a week. You just need to lean in. You're an immigrant being exploited and underpaid for manual labor. Sounds like a skill issue. Did you guys know that you have the same number of hours in your day as Bill Gates? Get to work. Nobody wants to work anymore. You gotta get off your ass and work. From the capitalist point of view, if you're unsuccessful under the current system, it's because you suck. It couldn't be that there's anything wrong with the system. And this individual thinking trickles down. See what I did there? Trickles down. Into discussions surrounding mental health. Let me ask you this. Do you think that money brings happiness? How many of you are depressed because of your job? Or anxious because of climate change and endless war? Do you think you would be less depressed if you didn't live to work? If you had enough to support your basic needs? if your health, your life expectancy, and your education weren't predicated on how much you had in the bank? But now the capitalists are getting nervous. If the people keep thinking like this, they might unionize for better wages. They might mobilize for better work-life balance and fewer working hours. Hell, if they continue, they might overthrow the whole damn system. Of course, this is an oversimplification. The question of mental illness calls back to the nature versus nurture debate, and in my opinion, what we call mental illness is a combination of both. People experience real changes in the brain from traumatic events, which is well documented, and if you'd like to read more about it, you should definitely pick up The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. But The Body Keeps the Score acknowledges that poverty can be traumatic, and that if we really want to address the mental health crisis, we have to invest in health, education, and other social programs. The critique here is that the neoliberal capitalist system puts the onus on individuals without fully taking into consideration the impact of social conditions. In Rose's words, governing in a liberal democratic way means governing through the freedom and aspirations of subjects rather than in spite of them. The possibility of imposing liberal limits on the extent and scope of political rule has thus been provided by a proliferation of discourses, practices, and techniques through which self-governing capabilities can be installed in free individuals in order to bring their own ways of conducting and evaluating themselves into alignment with political objectives. Through self-inspection, self-problematization, self-monitoring, and confession, we evaluate ourselves according to the criteria provided for us by others. Through self-reformation, therapy, techniques of body alteration, and calculated reshaping of speech and emotion, we adjust ourselves by the means of the techniques propounded by the experts of the soul. The real power is when you're acting in the capitalist interest because you think that you want to. You are a worker with a capitalist inside watching a worker. You get to a point where you don't actually need to be surveyed because you're surveying yourself. Shout out to the Panopticon. But what if you still can't hack it? You tried the pills, you tried the therapy, but you still just want to burn shit down. Well, there's a solution for that too. Basically, the bitch is crazy. Martin Luther King said, "There is a word in modern psychology which is now probably more familiar than any other words in psychology. It is the word maladjusted. But there are some things in our social system that I'm proud to be maladjusted to. I never intend to adjust myself to the viciousness of lynch mobs. I never intend to become adjusted to the evils of segregation and discrimination. I never intend to become adjusted to the tragic inequalities of the economic system, which will take necessity from the masses to give luxury to the classes. I never intend to become adjusted to the insanities of militarism, the self-defeating method of physical violence." Marx says, "The less you eat, drink, and read books, the less you go to the theater, the dance hall, the public house, the less you think, love, theorize, sing, paint, fence, etc., the more you save, the greater becomes your treasure, which neither moths nor dust will devour, your capital. The less you are, the more you have. The less you express your own life, the greater is your alienated life. The greater is the store of your estranged being." I hope that you liked this video. If you did like it, please subscribe because there's more where that came from. I have a whole list actually, and I'll have maybe people vote on it in the community tab. All 48 of my subscribers. Hey! This channel is supposed to be about history, politics, and books. I have some other videos that maybe I'll put over here. I have one about white women and slavery, and I have another about how Europe underdeveloped Africa. So if you're interested in either of those subjects, maybe go watch these videos. And yeah, thank you so much for watching, and smash that subscribe button. I don't know where it is, but smash that subscribe button and the like button and even the comment down below. Gotta go. Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.